Hi, I'm Mobius Knott, a left-wing academic who keeps getting made redundant and sometimes being mistaken for a barista. I'm here to deconstruct the political issues that are shaping the 21st century. Recently, Farage and others in Reform have been ranting about the political polls. In this leftover, we're going to analyse whether there's any substance to his claims, what Farage's rant reveals about the Reform project, how his party's position is more precarious than he would have you believe, and how all this links to prospects for beating Reform in the long run. So to start at the beginning, Farage claimed that Reform are strong in all polls except YouGov. He suggested that they were making, and I quote, bizarre adjustments to suppress the true figures. Now, this claim is tenuous for several reasons. Firstly, while Reform is certainly leading the polls right now, the party has actually been on a decline for several months. They peaked at about 30% average at the end of 2025 and have since then dipped quite considerably. They currently sit at about a 26 or 25% average and could look set to possibly dip lower. Now, there are many reasons for this, some of which we'll cover later. However, one of the things which it is not down to is YouGov. YouGov has pretty consistently, and I am a sad person who looks at polls a lot, by the way, and you can check this is all quite easily available online, but YouGov has pretty consistently polled Reform lower than other pollsters. But they have been doing so ever since the Reform Party started its surge in the polls more than 18 months ago. Now, Reform's polling decline recently has actually been pretty consistent across most major pollsters. Even Find Out Now, who for a long time were giving Reform relatively high ratings, have shown a dip in support to about 24-25% over recent weeks. So Farage is not the victim of some sort of YouGov conspiracy. And looking at the company's raw data, there does not appear to be any particular anti-Reform adjustments. Now, this is not to say that I endorse YouGov's polls, which may well be inaccurate in one way or another. Polling is a treacherous and slippery business at the best of times with significant margins of error, even if via large-scale data analysis you can sort of get a sense of a larger trends, and this becomes more and more revealing the closer and closer you get to an event such as general election. But by focusing on YouGov's polls individually, Farage opens himself up to this issue because some pollsters are actually extraordinarily generous to Reform, with considerably larger gaps between Reform and the other parties shown in their results. Without providing some sort of detailed or at least substantiated analysis to back up his claims about YouGov, people can just as easily draw attention to these other pollsters, which makes Farage look like a bit of a crybaby. And this is not a good look for Reform. And it's a look they've been sporting quite a lot recently, where losses or anything unfortunate happens to them is projected onto other people. And then they're having tantrums on social media, and it may well play well to their loyalists and to the core audience. But if they're trying to build an electoral base, it's not a good look. More broadly, there's lots to learn from this polling situation, and we can begin to do so by zooming out and noting that Farage has here celebrated having around 25 to 30% in the polls and being the largest party on this basis. This is down to how first-past-the-post electoral systems work, where the UK general elections are based on votes at the constituency level. And in a given constituency, 70% of people might be opposed to the Reform candidate, but because their vote might be split 3 or even 4 ways, the Reform candidate might win. Because of this, some analyses have suggested that Reform could get over 300 seats if their peak position in the polls was to be replicated at a general election. Now, it's worth stressing, however, that even at 30%, it is not statistically clear that Reform would win an outright majority, even if they probably would be the largest party. And that's why bookies are favouring a hung parliament as the most likely outcome of the next election. And it's worth saying that bookmakers are usually very, very good at guessing the results of political elections. Usually, not always. They have lots of people working on it because there's a lot of money going into it and lots of detailed calculations. Those disclaimers aside, this is an incredibly troubling statistic because it means that Reform could get nearly, or perhaps more than, half of the seats on less than 30% of the votes. Or to put it another way, less than 30% of people's votes would count more than the other 70% of votes. Considering general election turnout is usually around 60%, this means that in effect less than 20% of registered voters might vote for the party that forms the next government. In numerical terms, assuming relatively similar numbers of registered voters to 2024 at the next general election, this would amount to something like 7 to 9 million votes for Farage and the Reform Party, and 20 to 20 million votes to parties that are not Reform. Factoring in non-registered voters, it's possible that barely 10% of the country's total population would have voted for Reform. Even Labour under Keir Starmer in 2024 received more votes than this, and that was an election that was lost by the Conservatives rather than won by Labour. So Reform, even at their recent peak, are only going strong in the polls in the sense that they looked well positioned according to our broken electoral system, not because the majority of the public supports them. And you don't even need to take my word for it on how broken our electoral system is. Farage himself used to complain about the brokenness of our electoral system back when UKIP got about 3.9 million votes, but only one seat or something back in 2015. But now he seems quite happy with the state of affairs. Now, there are several reasons why Farage might want to divert attention away from the fact that Reform is experiencing a decline in the polls. His party needs to look like they're viable, that they are winning the argument, and like they're the insurgent apparent, to appeal to many of their key audiences, including people on the right wing of British politics, disgruntled Tories, and others who are just simply politically confused. Now, just to note, by the way, these are the categories we're going to use for now. They are slightly informal, but they're useful for analytical purposes, so we're going to work with them. Now, to begin, Farage, we all know, he benefits considerably from support from the far right. The far right has for a long time seen Reform as the best vehicle for their agenda. But as Farage this year and last year has tried to make himself seem more respectable and to broaden his support, many on the far right are having second thoughts. Many were really upset by the shadow cabinet thing where former Conservative MPs were recruited by Farage. They're very, very upset about this. And this is why far right spaces, for those of you who, I'm saving you from having to go look yourself, but terrible places. But they take a much harder line than Farage's Reform Party does currently. These people, the more that Reform dips in the polls, the more they might feel emboldened to sort of gamble on Low's Restore UK. Similarly, Farage enjoys the support of disgruntled Tories who perhaps aren't quite so right-wing as these people, but pretty right-wing. And this sort of support has only increased since the collapse of the Tory party in 2024. Yet if Farage starts to look less strong, these disgruntled Tories might start to inch back towards their former home. And this is really easy to imagine because we have a scenario where actually Farage is declining just before the local election's about to start, and Badenoch is looking a bit better. If the Conservatives do better than expected, or they're probably still going to really suffer, they could do better than expected, and people might actually gain a bit of confidence in them again, or they could do as bad as expected, and perhaps people will move in and remove Badenoch, and they might put someone who will compete more with Farage, because for that particular constituency, Badenoch hasn't appealed and she hasn't been a very effective operator. Now, these two factions are both important for another reason, the right and the far right, that is. They both safeguard the priority of capital, and that means that wealthy capitalists ready to donate money are inclined to go with people who support these causes. And if Farage looks less likely to win, these wealthy right-wing donors will be much less likely to bet money on Reform UK, or at least they might be more inclined to diversify their stock holdings. They might, let's say they're going to give £1 million to Reform UK, they might give, let's say, £800,000 to Reform UK and £200,000 to the Conservative Party, which will then allow the Conservative Party to do more, which then puts more pressure on Farage. And all of those small sort of donations start to add up. However, the self-consciously right wing in British politics is only one of the constituencies that Reform as a party is appealing to, and this is often forgotten. So if there's anything people take from this, I would stress paying attention to this, that they're also appealing to voters who are politically confused or see themselves as very political or whatever. Now, this might be that guy down the pub who has actually read, the Communist Manifesto, but somehow thinks that, someone came to the strange conclusion that getting rid of immigrants will solve their problems. Or it might be the person who hates politicians and sees Reform as a sort of none of the above option, who might shake things up a bit, or perhaps a person with working class chip on their shoulder, like who has been betrayed by Labour and buys into the common man image that Farage has spent more than 3 decades trying to nurture. Despite the fact that he's a millionaire who owns multiple homes, who's gone to a very expensive private school, worked as a banker, has all of these sort of experiences that most people cannot imagine. That his social life is completely different to these people, but there's been this effort throughout the media to make him look normal when he is anything but normal. Now, in all of these cases, for a long time, Farage may have looked like the most viable option to express these sort of opinions. But now there's alternatives arising, certainly for some of these groupings, right? Zach Polanski and the Greens are starting to make progress into the sort of anti-establishment spaces, and a dip in the polls for Reform might signal to such voters that the future lies elsewhere. And there's also the element of Rupert Lowe, where Rupert Lowe is doing a similar look to what Farage has cashed in on for a long, long time. And people might just, go, buy into the Rupert Lowe version of the Farage performance. But a poll dip may also affect those who wouldn't stop voting for Farage, the real loyalists. Because without exaggeration, and in very rough terms, but there's sort of about 10 to 12% of the public who would vote practically for any party that Farage was leading, simply because of a sort of parasocial attachment to him as a media and culturalized figure, which is, those 30 years have really paid off in this respect. And it would take a lot for these people to abandon him, right? But these are the people who got behind Reform UK only when he decided to be its leader. And they're the same people who abandoned UKIP when he did, all those years ago. And this constituency will not abandon Reform simply because of a dip in the polls, even if some may be enticed elsewhere. We've said about Rupert Lowe already. But they are exactly the sort of people that Farage needs to be very enthusiastic, to think he's going to win, to be singing his praises, and will hope to convince them to leaflet and act as foot soldiers for reform in the upcoming election. Yet their enthusiasm could be greatly affected if they think he just doesn't really have a chance of winning. And this actually applies to Farage himself. And it's worth going back on Farage's biography a little bit, because for a long time he was not going to run in the 2024 general election. And after failing, this was after failing to secure a seat for like 30 years or something. And he seemed to not want to try again. And he'd actually said he wasn't going to try again. But the pressure mounted. And, there was a particularly striking moment where Piers Morgan goaded Farage on an episode of Question Time, saying something along, I think it was, "You've bottled it," something along those lines. And it was like a few days after that Farage U-turned. And there are several rumours already, which I've came across, and several curious claims by people involved with the reform project, of Farage standing down before the next general election. Now, on a personal level, is it that Farage might need to deny the poll dip to keep his own spirits up? Does he need to believe that he can do it? Is that he's winning? But is he already feeling the strain more than 3.5 years before the next general election? And that's a long time to keep your spirits up. And that's the point, right? All of this is showing on so many levels that Farage's bluster is seemingly an attempt to mask a sort of fragility, personal and organizational and politically. He's like the guy who's insecure about something, right? Let's say, and buys an expensive car to make up for it, a really expensive, flashy car, solely because they're insecure. And a reform victory depends on an awful lot going right, but actually a lot can go wrong instead. And sometimes we're forgetting this because Labour is doing so terribly and the Tories have been decimated that we can forget that things can change incredibly quickly. And actually, people are starting to remember that with the recent rise of Zach Polanski, where actually people are like, oh, finally we've got something we can vote for, which isn't the more of the same and isn't this sort of dog whistle politics. With reform, it's a project that serves capital and the wealthy, and which needs the support of the not so wealthy, to which it must sell this really appealing image of how things will go. It is a political promise that must be captivating for an awfully wide array of particular constituencies. And these constituencies are only tenuously connected. Like, think of all the people we've mentioned up above. Like, they are very different walks of life. And reform has been able to capitalise on insufficiencies elsewhere to get some sort of support for them. And they need to keep all of these sort of diverse constituencies on side. And they sort of stack up like a house of cards. But if one is pulled away, the rest can very easily fall down. So we're ill-served, and because I think there's a temptation to do this, but because we're ill-served to see reform as a big abstract sort of blob of homogeneous voters. Of course, like, let's call a spade. Many on the far right are racists who lack consciousness and are, class consciousness, and are simply looking for the most anti-race, anti-non-British party that looks viable. But Farage's weakness is precisely that these are not the only people who are voting for him. Others may tolerate or find some level of dog whistling appealing up to a certain point, but only up to a point, and they will get off the bus when things go a little bit too far. And the example here is the disgruntled Tories who have slightly more nuanced views on immigration than a lot of people around reform do. And they may well have issues with small boat crossings, but they also be, and small business owners, right? The small business owners who say, for instance, benefit from good relationships with their local communities, and they have employers who are non-white, and they might think that the demonization of non-white British people is going too far. Another example, and this is key, and it's often, again, not spoken about in the media, is that many large investors benefit currently from immigration, allowing capitalists to sort of exploit foreign workers or benefit from cheaper domestic labour by driving the prices down. The default with large capitalists and large businesses is not to raise wages to be more competitive, but to keep them static and look for people who are financially disadvantaged, and they don't train people to do jobs. They just sort of find that ready-made, which is sucking up parasitically, like sort of like a leech off of the infrastructure globally. And it's having devastating effects, and this has gone downhill in this respect even more. It's never been good. Right? It's never been good, but it's got so much worse in recent years. Now, Farage's announcement and this is where Farage has tried to address this, because these capitalists might be worried about this, right? He needs to get these sort of capitalists on board. And he made this announcement over lowering the minimum wage for 16 to 24-year-olds. Now, this, from the eyes of such a capitalist, sort of offers a solution to the issue if there is actually a cut down in immigration numbers, right? In legalized immigration numbers. And there's other reasons why Farage might have gone for this. That it may appeal to some sort of disgruntled Tories who believe that this is a way of getting young people jobs, because young people are not getting employed for all sorts of reasons, which we don't have time to go into right now. But even though this can appeal to these sort of constituencies, keep the donors on board, keep the disgruntled Tories on board, whilst also holding to these sort of racialised things, young people more broadly and the anti-establishment crowd more narrowly are less likely to be sympathetic to this sort of idea. Whether for the sake of self-interest or seeing in this the sort of a continuation of the exploitation that is associated with establishment. So those anti-establishment people will see reform as not actually changing because of something like this. Considering the voting franchise is about to be extended to 16-year-olds, this might end up being actually a particularly terrible mistake on the part of Reform and Farage. And it's a mistake driven by the fundamental contradiction between the interests of capital and the employers and the workers. Now, in the end, the Reform project is an attempt to provide a sort of illusory reconciliation of these contradictions, whilst safeguarding the way things work, how current systems of capitalism work. To do this, however, to convince people that they offer a solution, Farage needs to look like he is winning. Or gaining ground, that they're here to save the day. And Farage's rant about YouGov points to how actually he cannot take for granted that he will convince people that this will happen. With a general election not likely happening for 3 years, there's a lot that can happen, and a lot that the 70% of people in the UK who do not support reform can do to stop a catastrophic sequence of events from unfolding. This, to my mind, this begins with firstly demystifying what's happening, even on basic levels, because I think a lot of people genuinely buy into the ordinary bloke image of Nigel Farage and Reform UK more broadly, and they don't realise that, for instance, Nigel Farage is a very rich man with multiple properties and all of these things. And there's also the pointing out the very unsavoury elements of the Reform project. Even Farage, again, we're focusing on Farage, but he's content to be paid just £70 to repeat far-right slogans, which is that's how easy he can be bought, right? Via the Cameo scandal, which came out recently. And he can say that he doesn't believe them. He's still willing to say things like that for the sake of £70, it's really not a good look. Now that's a wrap. If you want to hear more analyses about what's going on in the world, do consider subscribing. Though alternatively, if you think I'm an idiot, I'm really happy for you to tell me. Just write a comment and write an essay for me if you want. I will try to respond. But either way, have a good week.